again for joining us for another Azure App Dev webcast series. And today your presenter is John Garland from Wintellect. So John, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself and cover the topic.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. And see my screen. Let's check the basics here.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good afternoon. Well, maybe good morning to some. Our topic today is going to be a bit of a developer's introduction to Azure Active Directory B2C service. And with a little bit of okay, what does it take for me to get this into my application? And what does it offer me? And what does it offer my application? A little bit about myself. I am the Vice President of Learning at Wintellect. Wintellect, we do, hopefully some of you all have heard of us. We do consulting. We do instructor-led training. We've done a lot of training for many, many years. And we provide an on-demand training service. I myself am an Azure MVP, a certified trainer, a developer, a certified developer associate, an advisor, and a cloud solution architect. I've been working with Azure for quite some time and fairly extensively. But to the topic at hand here, so what are we interested in doing? Why are we here? Why are we talking about Active Directory B2C? And when it comes time to make an application available to users outside of your organization, you've got some implementation decisions that you're going to need to make. You can certainly write your own authentication solution. The problem is, in reality, doing it correctly is really difficult and really quite nuanced. And if you get it wrong, you really can be in front of some pretty severe consequences. It can be anything from regulatory sanctions and fines, or a combination of the two, if you expose user information you're not supposed to expose. Or it can be even a matter of losing your customers' trust. And I know it sounds cliche, but this is trust that take years to get to accumulate and years to gather, and you can lose it in just minutes. It's really a quite valuable asset you want to make sure you don't risk needlessly. When you're also making your application end user or customer facing, one of the things you'll want to do is consider credential fatigue with your customers. How many different credentials do they have? I wish I could find a statistic that kind of showed the average number of online identities that the average household in the United States happens to be required to maintain. But bottom line is, as we go to more sites and log in, and I have to sign in here and sign in there, and if you have to provide unique credentials to each of these sites, you end up getting a tremendous number of credentials, and you either have to rely on credential managers to track all of your various username and password combinations, or you get into bad habits where you start repeating username and password combinations, or a mixture of the two. And sometimes it's really convenient to be able to say, well, I already have a few key IDs that I use in a few key places. I got my Microsoft ID, I might have my Office 365 ID, a GitHub account, a LinkedIn account, a Twitter account. Why can't I just reuse those and leverage those to tell another site who I am? Another consideration is, okay, users coming to your site, what do you need to know about them? And on one hand, you've got considerations, privacy considerations and regulations like the new GDPR, where you don't want to collect any more than is absolutely necessary. But what is that absolutely necessary line that you want to draw? And what is that user experience you want to provide in terms of customization and putting the right information in front of your end users based on who they are, what they need to know? Let's see, another one is, well, that's well and good, but when I sign my users into my site, I actually want it to look like my site is involved in the process. I don't want some very jarring experience that makes the user wonder how they got to this page and it seems to have nothing to do with the page where I started. How do I brand it and blend it and make it look like it's part of what I'm trying to provide for them? Oh, and talk a lot about web applications, but maybe you also have mobile or other native applications that you want to provide to your end users. So with all that you have to consider, Azure Active Directory B2C is one solution to all of these problems. This service attempts to address a few different things. Number one, it's built on top of Azure Active Directory, and that being a system that protects a large number of resources in the Microsoft portfolio, and fairly critical resources at that, whether it be enterprises with O365 and SharePoint and the Office tools, and the Office suite, and all of the things under that umbrella are all governed and interact with Azure Active Directory. So not only is it something that there's a ton of work being done to make sure it is secure and safe, but also it is robust and available. Another nice thing about this is it's a federated solution. The idea being your application isn't involved in the process of gathering credentials from your end users. You're farming that out to someone else. At no point does your code actually see an end user password, and if you don't see it, you can't lose it. So with that in mind, you're really cutting down one vector of risk that you don't necessarily have to worry about as much, in so much as you trust Azure Active Directory and the resume that I provided about it just a second ago. In terms of customizability, you can allow your users to use credentials that are specific to your application, to your service, or you can allow them to use a combination of different federated identities. Things like Microsoft accounts, Facebook accounts, Twitter, Google, Amazon, let's see, Weibo, QQ, WeChat, GitHub, and if those aren't enough, you can also create custom connections with OpenID Connect providers. And OpenID Connect being a standard for authentication, which also happens to be supported by Azure Active Directory tenants. So you can include an Azure Active Directory set of credentials in that mix. Another thing you can do is you can select and customize the information that you're collecting for your users and what information is actually exchanged in the authentication tokens that go back and forth between the applications and the servers. You can customize and choose how much information is there and what is gathered. We'll see a bit of this in the demo here later on. Let's see. So another one is you can also tailor the end user experience. You can make it match your site's branding. You can also provide localized login experiences based on the end user's browser location. And then you can also provide a ton of additional customization through an underlying authentication framework. It's called the Identity Experience Framework, and it underlies the whole Azure Active Directory tooling, Azure Active Directory B2C tooling, and you can provide an extremely customized authentication experience there. Not only just gathering credentials, but maybe you want to gather multiple credentials for a user. You want to gather a user's login ID, but then you also want to tie that in and collect their Xbox gamer ID and have both of them as part of the user information. You can deal with that. You can call out to services and functions and other things within this tailored experience. Oh, and by the way, someone's already done most of the heavy development work for you with this, and there's a tremendous amount of value in that idea. Not only do you not have to worry about the nuanced development, you don't have to worry about much of the development at all. In fact, you can focus on what's important for you and your business and just let the identity pieces do their job. Okay, so that's a bunch of talk about this. Let's actually take a second and see this in action. So let me cut over here to my demo site. We'll come to the resources here a little bit later. So I'm going to start here in the Azure portal, and I've opened it up to my subscription. And the first thing you may want to do here is you may want to create yourself an Azure Active Directory B2C resource. To do that, you would come up here to create a resource. Under Identity and it's way down at the bottom here. You'd select Azure Active Directory B2C. And you'll notice you have two options here. The first one is you'll create a new Azure Active Directory B2C tenant. You'll enter a name for the organization that you're a part of, and then you'll enter the domain name for the tenant. And this is a demo. I'm not actually going to create this right now. It takes a couple minutes, but it does have to be, this does become part of a URL. This does have to be a globally unique address here. But once you provide this information and the region in which the bulk of the work will be done, you can go ahead and hit the create button, and that will create this new tenant. It says here it takes a minute. It's anywhere from a minute to 3 or 4 minutes. We're going to skip this in favor of tenants that I've already gone ahead and created. But the next thing that you have to do is you have to associate a tenant to your subscription. The Azure Active Directory tenant lives above any particular Azure subscription, and in order to use this as a service, you need to tie it to an Azure subscription. So, among other things, it can be billed properly. So you would select this, you would choose the Active Directory tenant that you'd created, choose which subscription you'd want to tie it to, create an entry in a resource group for it, and hit create. And another minute or so later, this will go ahead and create that entry into your resource group. You'll see I've got a resource group here that I've got 2 B2C tenants set up with that I can work with. Okay, within the B2C tenant, so we're going to start with this very simple demo tenant that I've gone ahead and set up. The landing page for B2C really gives you the guidance to go ahead and set this up for authenticating with your application. And it really is a bit of a 1, 2, 3 process. The first thing you have to do is register an application. So create an entry for an application that will be using B2C to authenticate. Establish the identity providers that the B2C will be allowing to provide credentials when somebody's authenticating, and then create this thing called a user flow. These used to be called policies, and you'll see a lot of the verbiage between policy and user flow is still a little bit interchanged. But the idea is it defines what the user journey is going to be throughout the authentication experience. To register an application, I can just register a very simple one here. Let's call it Wintellect demo. I'm going to say that this is a web application. I'm interested in using a web application. And I do have to supply a reply URL. This is the applications that will be calling me in order to request credentials will be lining up or will be coming from one of these URLs. These URLs actually need to source from the same domain, with the exception that localhost for development experience seems to get a little bit of latitude in that regard, that you can have a formal domain as well as a localhost mixed in there. In my case, I know that when I'm developing my application, which I'll show you here in a moment, its URL is going to be this localhost 44330, and I need to add this sign in OIDC endpoint to the end. If I go ahead and hit the create button, it'll go ahead and create an instance of that application. And you'll notice it will create or return to me this application ID. I'm going to need this application ID in my application when I want to connect and authenticate against Azure Active Directory B2C. I'll need to be able to tell it, among other things, I'm authenticating with this particular application. Other settings that we may want to see in here, again, we see that it's the web API. I can come in, I can add additional reply URLs after the fact. I can go ahead and add and create entries for native applications like phone applications or desktop applications or other instances. Let's see. The other thing I'll take a look at here briefly is the identity providers. Out of the box, we support using an email address to authenticate. So a user, we can give the authentication experience the ability to have credentials that are directly tied to the application or specific to this application. You don't have to use those, but it's available if you want to use it. Otherwise, I could add another identity provider, and I'll go over this in a little more detail a little bit later, but I can choose from these and configure from this list, or I mentioned the OpenID Connect, which allows me to create a customized experience. I can choose the user attributes that I can collect from. I can customize this, and we'll see this again a little bit later. But let's get on down to the user flows. What I mentioned previously had been called policies. For this authentication experience, I'm going to create a new user flow. And you'll see I've got a few different options for the user flows I can use here. I can create a sign up and sign in flow, a profile editing flow, or a password reset flow. And we've got a few other types here in preview. I'm not going to go into detail on these, but these are coming over time. We'll try the sign up and sign in, and we'll go ahead and give this one a particular name. And this is going to be Wintellect Susie Demo, Susie for sign up and sign in. I want to use the email identity provider. I have to select at least one identity provider, and if I hadn't defined any of the social ones previously, the only one I can use at this point is the email provider. I can choose whether or not I want multi-factor authentication enabled for the local provider. The third-party identity providers, if they have multi-factor authentication set up on them, it follows it with the authentication experience for them. And I can choose which user attributes or claims I would like to collect or return inside of the tokens that are part of the authentication process. There's a quick list here, or I can select more and return others. Again, a little bit later, we'll dive into these and what we can do with them. I'm just going to really quickly create this user flow. And with it created, I'm going to take a look at what it gives me. Initially, I've got a set of properties. Within it, again, we've seen one of these already, multi-factor authentication. JavaScript and page layout is a preview feature. We're not going to go into that much today. Information about the lifetime of the token and restrictions or limitations on the tokens that we're working with. Information about what's actually contained in the tokens. Session behavior, and even password complexity, where I can switch from simple, very easy passwords all the way to a customized, where I can define what requirements and restrictions I want to, or my regulations happen to insist that I need to put onto the passwords. If I hit the Run User Flow button here, it'll open up this blade to the side that shows and gives me the opportunity to actually test out this user flow. I can choose which application I'm selecting in it, what reply URL if I had entered more than one, and the domain. You'll notice that the domain is listed as wintellectdemo.b2clogin.com, and the other option is login.microsoftonline.com. It used to be always login.microsoftonline.com, but that became a little tricky for things like single sign-on or for password managers because everything was login.microsoftonline.com. So it couldn't really things couldn't differentiate between logging into one site over here and another site over there, whereas the named wintellectdemo.b2clogin.com allows it has information in the URL that specifies a little bit more narrowly what application or what authentication provider we're happening to be used at the moment. I'm actually not going to run this directly, but just note the URLs here, and I'll leave this here and switch back to it in a minute. I'm actually going to jump into my application and start talking about how we leverage what we've set up here in order to get some in order to tie and provide authentication experiences in the application. So over here in Visual Studio, I've got an ASP.NET Core application set up and ready to go. The experience is very similar for ASP.NET, regular .NET Framework applications. It's a little bit different, but it is supported in a single page application like an Angular or React application. And there's documentation I can show you a little bit later that will will show you what you can do and how to go about setting up authentication in those other application types. The key thing is I'm going to add 2 pieces of middleware into the application, a pair of NuGet packages, and that would be the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication Cookies and OpenID Connect packages. You see them here. They've been added to my application. And then I can call inside of the service configuration in ASP.NET Core, add authentication method. And in there, I'm going to tell it I want my default authentication to use cookies. So if a cookie's been established in my authentication session, use its information first. And if not, the challenge scheme, okay, well, I don't know who you are, I need to find out, is going to leverage OpenID Connect. This extension method, add Azure AD B2C, is boilerplate code that I've taken out of the various samples that are available for B2C. To go ahead and configure the B2C authentication process. And looking at it, it's largely oriented at dealing with the Azure AD B2C options class that I've defined here and putting the properties that are available in those options into the right places for the authentication middleware to do its job. As we, well, actually, let's go and take a look at those options. You'll see I've got the this B2C instance, which is really part of a URL. If we come on over here in the settings, we'll see it as this Wintellect demo B2C login /TFP. And if we come back to our sample, we'll see Wintellect demo B2C login. That's where that has come from. The other part that we have in there, if I come back to options, I specify my Azure Active Directory tenant. I specify the client ID that I'm authenticating against. That's that application ID that we saw when we set up the application. The redirect URI, so when I'm going ahead and authenticating against this and send a request to authenticate, I'm telling it, okay, and this is the URI to which you will return my token, and that has to line up with the URL that I specified when I created the application, or one of the URLs in that list. And then the names of the flows that I'm going to be able to work with. The whole goal here is to put together a URL, which looks a little bit like this. So in this case, you see I've got the instance, the tenant name is over here. The name of the user flow that I want to use is right here, and then v2.0 indicating I'm using the 2.0 Azure Active Directory endpoints. If I come on back to that extension that I was working on here, one of the things you will see, again, it's setting those properties, setting that client ID, setting that authority, providing a event handler for when I'm redirecting to an identity provider. When my application is being told, go to an identity provider, I'm looking at my redirect context to see, okay, is there an entry for a given key? In this case, it's called the selected user flow key. We can call it anything we want. It's just a constant we've defined in order to be able to set and look up this key. But if that key is in there, then I'm going to go ahead and replace the URL. I'm going to find the name of the default user flow that we've established, and I'm going to replace that with whatever it is that's currently carried in that key. And that allows us to issue commands from the application to say, okay, I want you to go to Active Directory B2C for one of the authentication services that it provides. In this case, go to this particular user flow. And where that is applicable, where that is useful, is I've got this session controller over here that I call in response to the user clicking in the user interface. When they click on the sign in button, I just issue a challenge. My redirect URL is to go back to the main page when it is done. And just, the sign in is simple, use the defaults. For editing the user's profile, I might tell it to go ahead and I'll set the key value in the properties in those redirect, in the authentication properties. And I'll go ahead and use the constant, which is the the ID of the user flow I want it to go to. And then it'll catch that event handler that I showed you a minute ago. It'll rewrite that URL and redirect to that endpoint to accomplish that particular experience as part of the login process. The last real thing to show here is the idea of using the features available to us in ASP.NET MVC to enforce authentication. And in this case, I've got my claims page, my claims controller, that I don't want somebody coming into this controller unless they're authorized. I can set that all the way up at the controller level, but then the rest of my pages would be locked down, or I can set, sorry, at the controller class level, or at the individual controller level, or in a few other places inside of the application. Also, if I look at my views here, if I go to the login partial view, I can see that I can also use, if the user is authenticated, then I can conditionally control behavior. The big thing here, though, is that middleware that that we loaded from NuGet and that we configured really drives the process of setting a user identity and establishing claims within that user identity. And beyond that, our application doesn't really care where they came from. And Azure Active Directory just does the work in between the two. With all that being set up, I do need to go back to my settings here, and you'll notice I need to supply a client ID. If I come back to my application here, let's go ahead and close this, go to the application, and I need to retrieve this ID value. And I come back to my app, put that client ID value. I've got, here's the name of the user journey that I specified. Here's my redirect URL. Here's that instance URL to go to our particular Active Directory B2C instance. And here's the tenant that we created. With all that, if I run this locally here, and wait for it to run, and here we go. And we've got our shiny side up motorcycle parts website that we happen to be using for the demo today. If I go ahead and click on sign up or sign in, it's gone through that and it is redirected to Wintellect demo b2clogin.com with the tenant name up here, with the name of the profile, the default profile that we're using. We'll see we've got the client ID that's being passed in, the redirect URI that's being passed in, and so on and so forth. If I go ahead and click sign up, I can go ahead and create a new account here. I do have to send myself a verification code in order to sign in. While that is happening, I will, and let's see if that has come across yet. Yes, and let's type in then verify that verification code is going to be 968954. Verify it. Sure enough, it's a real email address. I hit create. It's going to create the account and return. And then I can go to this claims page. I didn't show this in the code. Let me show this really, really fast here. Oops, sorry, that's not where I want to be. If I come down here to the claims page, basically what I'm doing is I'm iterating through the user's claims collection and just showing. So these are the claims that are in the token that was provided to me by the authentication provider about the currently logged in user. If I go to the claims page, I'll see right now I'm not really returning a whole lot. This is the identifier for the user's ID, and this is the TFP Trust Framework Policy, what's now the user journeys. I signed in using the this policy ID. This user ID, FFAC, if I come on back and I bring up users inside of my Azure Active Directory and look up that user. Okay, come on, open them up. There we go. Sorry about that. I'll see that that corresponds to that user's object ID. So that is the underlying identifier for that user who was just created in our application. With that in mind, I can also go ahead and stop debugging. And I can go ahead and right click. Let's publish this on up to Azure. So we'll take this application and we were going to go ahead and publish it to an app that I have up here in my Azure portal. And within that application, I've got a set of settings already configured. These are those settings that you saw me working on inside of the application. Oops. And you'll see I do have to update my client ID. If I save that, but you'll see I've already set that B2C instance value. I've set that redirect URI. Notice now though the redirect URI isn't localhost, it's Wintellect B2C demo. I actually need to get that. I've got the flow, the flow name and the tenant name already in here. I'm going to take this redirect URI and I'm going to come on up here into my B2C instance over into my application and I'm going to add it as a new redirect allowable reply URL. And then once that's completed, I should be able to come on over here, click sign up or sign in. And this is at the deployed to Azure site. And I should be able to go ahead and sign on in. And sure enough, I've signed in. I don't want any of those things. And if I look at the claims, they're the same claims that I had a moment ago from the client side. So with just a little bit of boilerplate code, some NuGet obtainable middleware, and then establishing some settings both in my application and inside of Azure Active Directory B2C, I now have an authentication experience that will go ahead and allow me to provide authentication and authorization inside of my ASP.NET Core application. In fact, just to show this, let me copy my URL. I'm going to sign out. So I've signed out of my credentials, and sure enough, I can't get to that claims page because I'm not currently authenticated. Okay. So the next thing I want to show is, this is all well and good, but let's actually start working with different identity providers rather than just the one built-in email thing. And to do this, I'm actually going to go and use a pre-built web application, a pre-built, more fully fleshed out Azure Active Directory B2C tenant that I've already got set aside here. And while that comes up, I also need to completely overhaul my settings inside of my web application because I'm pointing it to somebody else who's going to be doing the identity provision for me. So momentarily, I'll come on up here and my URL, instead of being Wintellect demo, is going to be shiny side up. My tenant is going to be shinysideup.onmicrosoft.com. My client ID is going to also change. The application that I've defined up there is a different application. And we're going to go ahead and start with this identity provider sign up and sign in profile, as well as, user flow, as well as my, we're going to provide a name for the edit profile, edit user, user flow. If I come on up here to that particular instance, you'll see I've got my basic web application defined, application ID, I've got the reply URLs all set, similar to what we had before. But in identity providers, I've gone ahead and set up LinkedIn, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft account. And if I look at what I did here to set this up, you'll notice I've got I've created it, I gave it a name, I gave it a client ID and a client secret. To set up a relationship with an external identity provider, there's a bit of a handshake that has to happen. And it's different for every identity provider. You have to open up typically some kind of a developer site within, developer page within their site. and provide it with information about your application that you intend to use to call in and allow them to provide identity for. In turn, they will provide you with a client ID and a client secret that you go ahead and provide Azure Active Directory with that it will use when it's calling out to them. I mentioned these are all different, and they're different for every single provider. The Active Directory B2C team has done a fantastic job of documenting this, and they stay up on top of these documents. And on this site, go here, locate this on this page, locate that on that page, and walks you through the process of each one. I started here with the Microsoft application, but if you go with the Active Directory B2C documentation, under how-to guides, under identity providers, you'll see the identity providers that are available. So Microsoft account. In GitHub, I'll go ahead and go somewhere different and go through these steps, but it's a different set of steps for each one, and frankly, they'll change those over time. So the documentation here is a really good place to go in order to stay abreast of what you need to do to keep that properly configured, or to get to properly configure that when you want to use it. I come back down here to my user flows, my user flows, and I'm going to be using the identity provider sign up, sign in flow. A couple things to mention here. I'm actually collecting a couple user attributes for my users. I've got a parts supply website. I'll want to collect the user's first name, last name, their email address, and their postal code. And maybe I'll want to exchange that in the claims, as well as whether or not it's a first-time user and what the user's underlying object ID is. I'll go ahead and choose which identity providers I want to support. In this case, I've just flagged all of them. And beyond that, we should be ready to use this. So I will come on to, I'm going to bring up an incognito version of my browser just to clear any previous logins or cookies or anything else. Copy the link, and we'll go to our newly configured website. And go to sign up or sign in. And you'll see now that I have available to me the identity providers that I've configured. If I select the Microsoft account, for example, I can go to enter my live ID account, sign in, and in this case, it does use I've set up multi-factor authentication on this account. And I will approve it here on my phone. And I've gone ahead and signed in. If I look at the claims for that user, you'll see I now have some additional claims. I've got my name identifier and my object identifier that I selected, and one came in by default. I've got the postal code that I entered for that user, my name, and the email address that's available to me. If I come on up here to edit profile, I've got the ability to provide, and update that. And I don't know, let's go with that. We'll continue. And if I come over to claims, I probably need to sign out. Oh, no, sure enough. My claims got updated as part of my profile editing. So I'm now gathering information about the end user, number one. And number two, I'm leveraging a third-party identity provider. In this case, it actually will indicate my provider is live.com. That was able to authenticate that particular user. Okay, so the next thing that I want to show here is customizing the data collection. So I have a predefined policy that is going to help me out with that. Data collection, sign up, sign in. In the user attributes, I've gone ahead and added a new user attribute. You'll see it here. It's called manufacturer. If I go ahead and open it, you'll see I set it to be a string with a description of, well, who makes this bike? That's handy to know about a user when they're coming to a motorcycle parts store, is what kind of motorcycle they happen to ride. And that way we can put the right kind of sales or the right kind of parts in front of them. To add one, you just click add, you provide the name for it, test attribute, choose the data type, and enter a description for it. And that's all there is to it. Within my policy, going back to that data collection policy, under the user attributes, I've gone ahead and selected that. Under claims, I've selected that it's a claim that I'm going to return. But also here under page layouts, if I select my local account or my social account sign-in page, you'll see down here it lists the attributes. I can actually change the display name of them. So instead of given name, I can provide first name, last name. Instead of postal code, I can say zip code. I can also customize how the data is collected. In this case, I'm choosing for my motorcycle type, I want a drop-down single select, which is give me a combo box to choose from, and I can pre-populate it with display values and recorded values that then the user can go ahead and select from. I can also indicate as to whether or not these are optional or mandatory when the user goes and either edits their profile or signs in or signs up for the first time. So given that, let's go ahead and change our web application to use these user flows. So data collection and data collection profile. And you'll see I'm adding functionality to my application in terms of the authentication experience without actually having to code to my application or change the actual code in my application. We'll go ahead and once again bring up an in private view and come to our website. And sign in. And I'll just use this account. And if I go to edit my profile, you'll see I now have this manufacturer drop down with the values there. I'd already gone ahead and selected Honda. And if I look at my claims, I've got this extension underscore manufacturer claim with the name Honda in there for the choice that I've already made. So I can customize the information, the way that the information is presented to the user, what information I'm collecting, choose additional information I want to collect from them. But it's still, if I go to these pages, it's still very much not branded to my site. And that's the next thing I want to show here is what do you have to do in order to make this look a little smoother, a little more specific to your site. Now to do that, if I come back to the portal and I come to, oops, sorry, wrong one. If I already have, once again, a user flow that's defined to handle this. I come on down to page layouts, and you'll notice down here, I can go ahead and say, use custom page content. And when I do that, I provide a URL to where some content happens to live. In this case, I've set up Azure Blob Storage to host some web pages for me. I've set up CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, within that site to allow get and options verbs, I believe are the two. And then this will go ahead and blend in the HTML that I put there in with the content that B2C needs to display in order to authenticate a user. This one is very simple, very bare bones. And if I show it here, it really is simple, very no frills. The key thing is I have to have a div in it with the ID of API. And inside of that div element is where Active Directory B2C will insert the content that it needs to provide for the authentication experience. So if I come on back and update my application one more time, and I choose the simple user interface profiles that I've created, and then let's just sign out and sign back in here. While that is taking its time, make sure that everything's okay here. Yep. Okay. And then I go on and sign in. You'll notice it's lost all branding whatsoever on this page. This is pretty horrible looking, but it just meant to prove the point that I have taken complete control over the content or the look and feel of the content that's going to be presented here. If I go to my Edit profile page, it's similarly stripped down, a little more formatting to it, but not a whole lot more. That really doesn't look too nice. We can do better. And we've got this set of additional HTML files that I've uploaded that actually have a little bit more styling, a little bit more layout and finesse to them. And you'll see here, but I still have that key div, that API div here, where Active Directory B2C will drop its elements. But what I've also done is I've dropped in some CSS content here, and I can look up the tags that are being given to the elements by Active Directory B2C, and I can drop in styles that will affect those particular tags. So if I once again switch the profile that the user flow that I'm using in my B2C, in my application when it's calling B2C to authenticate, and go to my nice profile instead of my basic profile, and come on back to my application and sign out, and let it. And if I sign back in, you'll see I now have a sign-in page that's well branded to my particular site. One footnote that I forgot to mention when I was back here on the site, you do have to set up any assets you reference have to be fully qualified. They can't be relative paths, because you imagine this HTML is being brought into a different page or being used to be displayed on a different page. Relative paths aren't going to hold valid anymore, aren't guaranteed to hold valid anymore. So you do have to fully qualify your images, your style sheets, and other elements that you may be referencing. But back to the site here, you'll see I've now branded it. It lines up with the look and the feel of the page that I have underneath it. If I sign in here, and then I go to my edit profile, it's similarly been branded and styled and lines up with what I would expect it to be. Okay, so we've started with an application. I showed you, okay, if you bring in some middleware, use some code to configure that middleware, and provide some coordinates both to your application and to the Active Directory B2C instance, you now have the ability to have an authentication experience that lets you bring in existing identity providers. It lets you customize what information you're going to gather from the end user and how you're going to gather that information from them. It allows you to define custom claims that will be exchanged inside of the tokens. It allows you to, customize the look and feel of that experience as your user is using it from their site. The next thing really at this point is to talk about a few additional resources. I know this has been a bit of a whirlwind. There are some handy resources for working with this. The Active Directory Developer's Guide is a general purpose resource for working with Azure Active Directory. Very handy kind of one-stop shop for a whole lot of links that take you into other places in the Azure Active Directory documentation. The book, Modern Authentication with Azure Active Directory for Web Applications by Vittorio Bertocci, a former Microsoft developer, is a fantastic book on as the title indicates, modern authentication in a web application scenario. It really is an essential resource for developers. Specific to Active Directory B2C, I've got a couple of links here for just the general Active Directory B2C landing page. For the account integration page that I showed you relating to authenticating Microsoft accounts, as well as the neighboring links for how to use the other identity providers. Sample projects, I want to make sure I show this. There are a lot of samples that are provided for you to get started and moving ahead here. So it isn't just go to the documentation and try and stitch it together. There's currently, it looks like about 27 sample B2C projects that have been posted up here, whether it's working with a .NET Core application, a Xamarin application, whether you're going to be working with JavaScript with the Microsoft Authentication Library or with Hello.js. There's just a wealth of resources here for, okay, how did they do it and what do I need to do to make my application behave similar? And then the last thing is this user voice link where they indicate features that people would like and often progress on those various features inside of Azure Active Directory. So if you start working with Azure Active Directory and you're wondering what the status is of something that you may or may not see, or you would like to request a feature, I definitely recommend using the user voice user voice facility to provide or to go and look into that and maybe provide some suggestions. With all that in mind, thank you all. Are there any questions?
If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box. Go ahead and just type them in the chat window there. The chat window, if you don't see it in Teams, there's a toolbar towards the bottom, and there's a little tiny chat button that'll pop up. So you can go ahead and click that. We'll open up the conversation window, and you can type in there. As I mentioned, this recording will be posted. I will try to get this posted early next week so that you can go out to the Azure Ninjas website and be able to get access to this recording so you can share it with everybody. It looks like as of right now, we don't have any additional questions. So John, I would just like to thank you so much. This was a great presentation, a great overview. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else that was here enjoyed it too. So thank you very much for your time. And
oh, my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure.
All right. Have a great afternoon.
Well, thank you all.